Hey guys, it's Cece. And all my books are gone. They're gone. Look at all these empty shelves. Okay, so they're not all gone. They're not all gone. Most of them are in boxes and will remain there for a few months, which is terrible. But I did recently get rid of a whole bunch of books, and I thought I'd talk about it. So a little while ago, I did a live show on Hall where I just hung out with you guys for like 2.5 hours-ish. I went through every single book I owned and unhauled about 51 books. I already had a few others that I was getting rid of pre that live show, so I have more than 51 books here, but I figured that I should talk more about the books that I'm unhauling because everyone during the live show was asking for it, even though I was like, you guys, you're right here watching me unhaul the books. Do you need another video? Apparently you do. So let's get through this enormous stack of books I'm getting rid of. No, I'm very sorry. I can't send any books to any people. I'm in the process of moving. It's hectic. As soon as I film this video, I'm going to go get rid of all of these. I'm going to sell them back or I'm going to donate them to a local place. And that's the best that I can do. Everything's really up in the air and terrible right now. I hate moving, so I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, but I can't send you any of these books. Okay, now let's talk about them. We're going to try to get through this pretty fast because this is a big stack. So first up, we have Zeros by Scott Westerfeld, Margot Lanigan, and Deborah Bean Cotty. This was like the first book I ever got an arc of when I started my channel, so I kept the arc, but I'm never going to continue on in the series itself. So I decided to get rid of the first book in the series. I decided to get rid of the first book in the series, and I also got rid of the second book in the series, Swarm, because I never read it, even though I've had it for multiple years. Apparently, I just don't care enough about the series, so they're both going. Next, we have Challenger Deep by Neal Shusterman, which is a really interesting book as far as talking about mental illness from a different perspective. It was a fascinating book the first time I read it, but I'm never going to reread it again. And the thing that I used during my unhaul was, if I'm not going to reread it, I don't need to keep a copy. So, I'm not ever going to reread Challenger Deep, and therefore, I don't need it. So, goes in the unhaul stack. Next up, we have Jane Unlimited by Kristen Kishore, which I'm getting rid of because this is an arc, and I have a hard copy. So what I have to do is transfer all of these little sticky notes to my hardcover, and then I don't need this book anymore. So I'm getting rid of this arc because it's unnecessary. I am also getting rid of Perfect 10 by Elle Phillips. I never read this book, but I've had it for a couple of years, never read it, and I've heard pretty mediocre reviews overall. Like, it does not get a lot of praise and hype. So I'm not going to read it because there are a lot of other queer books I would rather give my attention to than one I'm not going to like. I'm getting rid of the full Wolves of Mercy Fall series. Well, not the full one. I never bought Sinner because that came out so many years after these books. I loved these for a long time. They are a paranormal fantasy with werewolves, and I know that I'm in the minority on people who have liked them. I did really like them for a number of years, but I'm never going to reread the series, and there are a lot of other Maggie Stiefvater books that I like more, so I'm getting rid of these. This one hurt a little bit because I do love them, but I'm never going to reread them. When am I ever going to reread a werewolf fantasy romance? I'm also getting rid of the full Stormglass trilogy. This is a trilogy sequel to the Poison Study books, and I never read the Poison Study books, I just read these. I loved them when I was a kid, but the more I thought about it, the more I remembered that there's a really, really problematic romance at the center of this, like a girl falls in love with her abuser level of problematic. So the more I think about it, the more I know that I'm never going to reread these because that's terrible. I also have books 2 and 3 of the Graceling companion series. So Graceling is one of my favorite books of all time. I absolutely kept Graceling. I want to reread that one again and again. I think it's wonderful and interesting and I highly recommend it. But I've never been compelled to reread books 2 or 3. Fire is actually a prequel that takes place a few hundred years before Graceling. Bitter Blue is a more direct sequel following a different character. They're both good. They're both really good parts of the series, but they're nowhere near as good as Graceling, and while I've read Graceling like 3 times, I've never really reread these. So that was my decision. I'm getting rid of them. Lately, I have been going out of my way to get rid of my older middle grade series because I just don't read middle grade anymore. So one of the classic series that I loved that I'm getting rid of is the 11 Thumps series by Obert Sky. There were 5 books in this series. As you can see, I loved them deeply. I read them with a friend. I obsessed over them. They were wonderful. but I'm never going to touch them again for the rest of my life. Because I don't read middle grade anymore. I just don't. I know that some people get older and they still do read middle grade. I very occasionally will pick up a new middle grade book, but I'm not likely to ever revisit middle grade, so these are going as well. Actually, let's talk about the rest of the middle grade I'm getting rid of. This almost feels like a theme that I'm getting into instead of just randomly grabbing books. I'm getting rid of Gathering Blue by Lois Lowry. This is the sequel to The Giver, which is, if not my favorite book, in my top 3 of favorite books. I love The Giver. I've read it numerous times. I've never felt compelled to reread Gathering Blue, even though I think it's a pretty good book. The rest of the Giver quartet just doesn't stand up to the first book. So I'm getting rid of Gathering Blue. Also getting rid of The Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart. This was a pretty standard book for middle grade around the year that it came out, around the years that I read it. Like early 2000s middle grade about kids who were a lot smarter than other kids and solve mysteries and get into adventures. We all read a lot of those. And this one was really good. It stood out among the rest, which is why it's held on my shelves for as long as it has. But I've grown out of it. I'm not going to reread it. We also have Forrest, Borne by Shannon Hale. Maybe this isn't middle grade. Maybe it's like upper middle grade. I don't even know. But this is the 4th book in the Books of Bayern. So the first book is The Goose Girl. I love The Goose Girl. I love Enna Burning, and I really, really like River Secrets. I've never cared for Forrest, Borne, and it's not necessary to the rest of the series. So I decided to keep the first 3 books in the Books of Bayern, which I love so deeply and would love to revisit, but I'm not going to read this again. Unless Shannon Hale decided, you know what, actually we do need a bunch more companion books in the Books of Bayern. Here are all these new ones. Then I'd track this down again and read it, because I would love to have additional companion books in that series. Speaking of Shannon Hale, I am also getting rid of the 3 books of the Princess Academy trilogy. This one hurt a little bit because I do love these books, and, like 2 of them. One of them is signed. But I'm never going to reread them. I love them, I highly recommend them, and I think that they're a ton of fun. They talk about girl stuff really, really well, like girl friendship, and later on, not even girl friendship, just friendship in general. But like I said, I was pretty dedicated to getting rid of most of the middle grade on my shelves. And the last middle grade I have is Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor, which I read, I liked, but I don't really think that I'm going to be continuing on in the next book in the series, so I don't think I'll be rereading this one. Okay, some more that aren't middle grade. Harry History by Melissa Anelli. This is the history of the Harry Potter fandom, especially around 2007 when the final book came out. It was super fascinating when I read it. I really enjoyed it, but that's kind of it for me. Like, I read it and I liked it years ago, but I kind of know the history of the Harry Potter fandom now. So, I don't need a book to tell me. We also have A Life as We Knew It by Susan Beth Pfeffer, which I liked a ton, but caused me actual anxiety when I read it, to the point that, like, I was unhappy for a couple of days while I was reading this book because I couldn't take it anxiety-wise. And that's not a great recipe for a reread. I'm getting rid of The Merciless by Danielle Vega because I read it once, loved it, and then went, you know, actually, that was only okay. That was really only fun the one time, and I'm definitely not interested in reading any of the sequels. This never should have gotten any sequels. What? Why? And so I'm getting rid of it. I'm also getting rid of Speak by Laurie Hull Sanderson, because when I read this at the beginning of my channel, I loved it. I gave it 5 stars and then never thought about it again in the 3 years since. Which I don't really think means it was a 5-star book. Usually my 5-star books are books that, like, months later, I'm like, oh man, remember that moment in that book? I can't stop thinking about it. I did stop thinking about this. So it was good, but not good enough to keep. We also have The Mystery of the Blue Train by Agatha Christie. I kept most of my Agatha Christie books, but this is my least favorite of hers that I have read and own, so I decided to get rid of it because it does not stand up to the likes of some of her other books. I'm getting rid of Scott Pilgrim, Volume 4, Volume 4, by Brian Lee O'Malley. I never am going to finish this series. I have like 1, 2, and 3 in a box in Pennsylvania. When I get there, I will get rid of those too. Never gonna finish these. I love the movie a lot, but I don't really care about these. I'm getting rid of Can't Wait to Get to Heaven by Fanny Flagg. This was nice. I like Fanny Flagg. It was sweet, it was cute, it made me cry a little bit, but it is, I mean, it's chick lit, and I had fun reading it, but that's kind of the end of the story with this, really. Like, I like it, but I'll reread Fanny Flagg's other books. What else? Beastly by Alex Flinn, the last Alex Flinn book that was holding onto my shelves. I used to have like 4 of these, and I've slowly been getting rid of them. These are fairy tale retellings that are set in modern day. I loved Beastly. I loved Alex Flynn's books. I read them a ton when I was in high school, but the key word there is that I read them when I was in high school. Not read a single one or felt compelled to pick up one since I graduated high school. So, I'm getting rid of it. I'm getting rid of a book none of you have heard of, Memory Palace by Hari Kunzru, which I only bought because it was required reading when I moved to London, and then I kept it because it was kind of interesting, but also one of the weirder books I've ever read, and I'm largely uninterested in revisiting it. Getting rid of Brooding YA Hero. This is by Carrie DeRizio. I just decided I'm not going to read this. I don't really have anything else to say about it, just that I kept looking at it, and the more and more I kept looking at it, the more I went, you know, I don't want to read this book. I'll just read the Twitter. I don't need to read a full book about it. This is going to be one of the 2 most controversial books in this stack, I think. I'm getting rid of The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. I liked this book, but also I think I was unwilling at the time that I read it to admit the ways in which it let me down, and it did. It did let me down in a lot of ways. And so while I've talked about how much I like this book, and I do recommend it, I never want to reread it because there was just a lot that was left to be desired for me when I was reading this book and processing this book, and I'm also pretty uninterested in reading the sequel, to be honest with you. So yeah, I think this one's going to be a little controversial because a lot of people love Gentleman's Guide. And I understand it was great for certain people who like certain things, but it didn't vibe for me as much. So, okay, I have the last stack in my hands. Next we have Sorcery in Cecilia, or The Enchanted Chocolate Pot by Patricia C. Reed and Caroline Stevermer. I got this book when I was really young, like 7 or 8, because my name is Cecilia. I kept stopping and starting it for most of my life. Finally, when I got older, I read the whole thing and was uninterested in trying to read more in the series or trying to reread this. It's a Fantasy of Manners book. It's interesting, but it's so deeply forgettable. Just so forgettable. Here's the other controversial one. I'm getting rid of The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. I read this when I started college and liked it. It made me cry a ton, but this is one of those books that I've never really felt compelled to reread. I don't love World War II books very much. I don't like war books very much. Don't read a ton of historical fiction. So I read this because it was super hyped and I liked it, but it was never going to be a favorite of mine, and I'm never, ever going to touch it again. Also getting rid of his book, I Am the Messenger. I read this when I was younger, never reread it, bought it so I could reread it, and still never reread it. I barely even remember what this is about. So I think that it says something that I've owned it for 6 or 7 years, never tried to reread it, never tried to relearn what it was about. I just think that that's a sign that I don't need it in my life. We also have The Sea of Trolls by Nancy Farmer, which this might be middle grade. It seems, it might be a little thick to be middle grade, but I read it when I was really young. I listened to it on audiobook. There are 2 more books in the series, and I just feel like I've kind of outgrown Nancy Farmer. I have one of her books that I still love, The House of the Scorpion, but over the years I've just slowly been getting rid of her books, and this was the final one that I'm just not that passionate about that I decided to get rid of. Also, Call the Midwife by Jennifer Wirth. This is a non-fiction book. It's been turned into a series. It was interesting. I learned a ton. Never going to reread it. Also have Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This is half inspired by Jeanette Winterson's real life and half like Arthurian myth, which is a weird combo, and I loved half of it, didn't understand the other half or why it was there, so I'm not going to reread it. I've held on to this for as long as I have because I bought it at a store while I was living abroad. So when I was living in London, I went to a shop called Gay's the Word, which is a gay bookstore, like a queer bookstore, but I got other books while I was there, and this was like my least favorite of those books that I purchased when I was there. And finally, the last book that I am getting rid of is 13 Little Blue Envelopes by Maureen Johnson, which I love. I've read it multiple times, but I can't take this cover anymore. It's so early 2000s that it actually pains me. This got re-released with a much nicer cover, and eventually I would like to buy that paperback, but I can't do it anymore. I know that this is like so ridiculous, but I'm getting rid of this book because I don't like the way it looks. That's it. That's the truth. Okay, there you go. Those are the books that I'm getting rid of, or the books that I unhauled during my 2.5-hour live unhaul. I got rid of a lot of books, but I'm hoping it will make it so much easier to drive across the country, so much easier to mix Janelle's books with mine when we have to try to fit them all on combined shelves. It's just going to make everything about transitioning a lot easier now that I don't have all of these books that I'm less passionate about. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Let me know if you enjoyed down in the comments below, and I will see you in another one very soon. Bye!